CSAC seminar, and the title of this seminar is The Myth of Nuclear Prestige. We're very honored to have Kevin Bustamante, who's one of our postdoctoral fellows here, who speaks to us today. Kevin is the MacArthur Hennessy Postdoctoral Fellow at CSAC. He was previously a postdoc at the University of Notre Dame, where he earned his PhD in 2024. His research agenda centers around questions of international security and racism, with a focus on nuclear politics. His work's been published in Security Studies, and his book project examines the transformation of dominant racial ideas over the last 2 centuries. Very small, narrow topic. It's amazing. It's just amazing to have him here this year. Super excited for the talk, and so he'll do the talk, and then we will do our usual with opening it up to the audience, starting with the other CSAC fellows. Kevin, floor is yours.
Just want to start off by saying thank you all for coming. Thank you to Ileana, Ali, and Tracy for setting this all up, and to my CSAC colleagues for really helping me out with this project over the last several months. It's come a really long way. The QR code is at the beginning, and then it'll be at the end. It's just a link to the website. But let's get started. I want to start off with this quote by Freeman Dyson, famous physicist, works on nuclear issues back then when he was still alive. And he says, he's like, I felt in myself the glitter of nuclear weapons. It is irresistible if you come to them as a scientist, to feel it, it's there in your hands, to release this energy that fuels the stars, to let it do your bidding. A remarkable, really powerful, flowery statement. I'm just like, when you think about nuclear weapons, it just sort of evokes this emotion. This is Robert Art, very well-known international relations scholar. Says a similar thing. Because nuclear weapons are one of the prime symbols of today's militarily powerful and politically important state, they enable the possessors to lay claim to be something more than mere regional powers. So you kind of get this sense, right, that nuclear weapons give you something more. They give you increased prestige and status in the world. Now, this is not just an academic sort of understanding of things, but it's actually one that reflects how U.S. policymakers have thought about nuclear weapons over the nuclear age. This is Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara testifying in front of Congress for why we need the Treaty on the Nonproliferation of Nuclear Weapons. This is what we know as the NPT today. He's testifying in front of Congress, and he says this. He's like, the decision to forego the development of nuclear capability is a difficult one, involving questions of international prestige. And if we want to have a successful nonproliferation program, it must not permit the acquisition of nuclear weapons or nuclear tests to increase the prestige, political influence, and power of a nation. Again, very cognizant of the appeal that nuclear weapons have in determining why states go nuclear. Here we have our very own CSAC director, Scott Sagan, saying in 1996, 1997, there was a time in which nuclear testing was deemed prestigious and legitimate in the 1960s, but today it's considered illegitimate and irresponsible. How do we explain that shift? Well, we have to look at the NPT regime. It shifted the norm concerning what acts grant prestige and legitimacy from the 1960s to being, in the 1990s, nuclear free. We have very different understandings of this sort of idea of nuclear weapons and prestige. And for me, the best way we sort of have an understanding of it today is something like this from Tom Schelling, which is nuclear weapons are under a curse, a taboo, despite the awe in which they are held and the prestige that may go with having them. So that leads me, again, this is sort of a general understanding of when you read a lot of nuclear scholarship, when you see a lot of nuclear discourse, you have this sort of conflicting ideas, which leads me to this concept of what I call nuclear prestige, which is very straightforward. It's this idea that nuclear weapons are international status symbols, and they have that position because of 3 reasons, right? They signify military power, they signify technological prowess, and they signify an association with great powers. And for a really long time, we've had this sort of understanding of nuclear weapons as something that caused, or at least once caused, a state to have greater international status by having them, because they serve as a visible symbol of a state's valued attributes. What I want to focus on is this sort of temporal discrepancy right here, like causes or once caused. We don't really know. For me, there's 2 big views on this issue. First one is what I call the enduring view of nuclear prestige. You have big names like Bob Gilpin, Bob Art, and much more recent scholars, Paul Beaumont and Lisa Langdon-Koch, will be here in about a week or 2, so you should come and see her speak, where they all argue the same thing. And I want you to pay attention to the dates, 1981, 1980, 2024, 2023, where they're all saying the same thing, which is Nuclear weapons are prestige markers. They give you something today, right? And then the second view is what I call the decline view, right? You have Scott Sagan saying nuclear weapons may have been prestigious once, but not anymore. You have Charlie Glazer, another big famous international relations scholar, saying the NPT eliminated much, if not all, of nuclear weapons prestige value. And just very much in recent months, you have Marina Duque saying nuclear weapons were prestigious, but they became stigmatized in the 60s and 70s. And if you get them today, you don't get any more international status. I want you to imagine that we have this sort of like crystal ball, that we were able to see the status value of nuclear weapons. It would probably look like this in that first view, right? The enduring view, which is nuclear weapons become unleashed to the world in 1945 with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then through 2025, the status value has always remained high. It's always caused greater national status, right? It's always had this sort of prestigious quality. This is not real data. This is just fictional, just for illustrative purposes. And then if we look at the decline view, it would be something like this, right? Which is, it starts off high, you get the NPT in 1968, 1970, and then it sort of just declines over time. So right now, here's basically the way nuclear scholarship understands nuclear prestige today, right? It's very much driven by this sort of basic question, which is, do nuclear weapons confer status? Some people say yes, some people say no. We have different conclusions saying nuclear prestige exists today, and some that say it started fading away about 50 to 60 years ago. And again, I want you to imagine our little crystal ball here, which is that this is effectively what they're arguing over, whether or not nuclear weapons still give you high status or not, whether or not the status value is still high or not. And what they effectively take as a given is that they were high once. Now, for me, this is actually extremely problematic. And it's problematic because it ignores a ton of nuclear history. It's a very selective reading of nuclear history. And what's that history? What's this? This is 1946. This is the Baruch Plan. This is the American proposal for international control of atomic energy. There was a general recognition soon after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that this bomb is extremely destructive and we need to have it under control. And in this plan, one of the proposals was we need to eliminate it from national armaments, right? No country should have it. This is 1955. This is the Lucky Dragon #5 incident. The United States is testing hydrogen bombs in the Pacific. You have massive amounts of fallout. You have radiation. This is Japanese journalists looking at this fish saying, can we actually eat this, right? Like, look at what it's going to do to us. You have a global scandal of nuclear testing has all sorts of dangerous implications, right? We need to get this under control. Sorry. 1955, again, this is the Bandung Conference, also known as the Afro-Asian Conference, where you have newly decolonized countries, much of the non-white world, meeting together for the first time, saying, what do we want for our future? And what they release at the end of it is they say, we need the elimination of atomic weapons. That what we really want is the harnessing of atomic energy for peaceful purposes. Today, we live in a world that's covered by nuclear weapon-free zones. This is what's in orange. So you have Africa, you have Latin America, that they basically renounced nuclear weapons. You can't station them there. We promise not to build them. And then, again, much more recently, you have the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is very much this sort of normative effort of we need to ban the bomb. We can't have these weapons of mass destruction existing today. So when I look at what nuclear scholars are saying about nuclear weapons, and when I see this historical record, this brings me to the puzzle that I'm going to try to answer today, which is this. How can a weapon of mass destruction be a status symbol? How can nuclear prestige exist alongside a global disarmament discourse? And for me, the answer is going to be is what we need to do is we need to problematize these first 20 years, which is that everybody assumes that nuclear weapons were born prestigious and then they had to later decline. I think this is problematic. There is no reason why we should assume this. We need to show this empirically that nuclear weapons actually had this value before we actually start assuming or trying to test everything else after. So my research question is, did the international community ever collectively recognize nuclear weapons as a status symbol? What I'm going to argue is, no, it never did. And again, I want you to imagine going back to our little crystal ball, which is getting tired by now. that if we could see the status value of nuclear weapons, it's actually always been low. So here's going to be the talk in very brief. I'm going to give a theory of status symbols. How do they emerge? Under what conditions do they emerge? And I'm going to look at the historical record in which I sort of think through like whether or not they actually met those conditions. And I'm going to say, no, they didn't. Superpower division and global contestation over nuclear weapons and what they mean actually prevented the emergence of nuclear prestige. So we actually never had this sort of world consensus that nuclear weapons are status symbols. And how am I going to do it? I'm going to use a sentiment analysis. I do multiple things, but for the purpose of today, I'm just going to do. I read a bunch of speeches, and I just hand coded all the times they actually talked about nuclear mentions in the United Nations general debate speeches. And what you see is just overwhelmingly negative discourse. And I'm going to talk about this later, but I'm also happy to talk about this in the Q&A of why I care about this sort of negative positive discourse. I know in the flyer for today, I said I had like 10,000 observations. I lied, I'm sorry. But part of it is for two reasons, I promise. Part of it is I changed the way I coded things. So like this is nuclear paragraphs, sort of like every sentence. So that cuts down a lot of the observations, but also I'm just not done yet. So my goal is to do 1946 through 2024. And I'm very much in the early period, but it's okay because what I showed you already is that a lot of nuclear scholars say this is supposed to be the period in which we're ever going to find evidence of nuclear weapons being prestigious. It's going to be in those first early decades. So what are the core contributions? I'm offering a new way of thinking about status symbols in IR, theoretically and methodologically, offering a new way to think about the symbolic meanings of nuclear politics. And very important for nonproliferation concerns is also offering a bit of a reconsideration of how we think about the effectiveness of the NPT and ideational change, right? There's this big argument that the norm shifted, and so people would have done it, but then they didn't because we had the NPT. And if you believe what I'm saying today, maybe that's a bit overstated, only because it's kind of like, well, if people didn't care about it in the first place, there's no reason to think that they would have gotten it for prestige reasons. The NPT works in 100 different other ways, but this is the basic of today. So what's the overview? I'm going to show you what people have talked about before. I'm going to give you my own little theoretical framework, methods, data, and then conclusion. Literature review. I'm going to adopt a bunch of very common definitions, which is in international relations, when we talk about status, we refer to as collective beliefs about how a state ranks on certain value attributes. It's all about positionality. It's about where you stand in a social hierarchy. It's not identity. It's not reputation. It's about positionality. And status operates at the level of second order beliefs. So it's what the group thinks about what the group thinks, right? Like I'm a postdoctoral fellow here, and the faculty and my students, like we all generally recognize that I am a postdoctoral fellow, right? Like I have a particular status within CSAC. Prestige refers to public recognition of admired achievements or qualities. Again, these are common definitions in how international relations thinks about status and prestige. So logically, this leads me to define status symbols, borrowing a definition from a recent special issue on status symbols in IR by Paul Beaumont and Paul Rowan, where they say status symbols refer to things that signal an actor's social status within a particular social context. I've modified the definition a little bit, but at any rate, this definition is a little bit too neutral for my taste, only because they're talking about like social standing as a general thing, high, low. But in reality, if you think about like a Rolex and like a prison jumpsuit, like they both signify social status. But when we talk about status symbols, we generally only mean in terms of the Rolex. So when I talk about status symbols, basically you're talking about prestige symbols. Right? Think of a Rolls Royce as a status symbol. We don't think of the Honda. And again, this operates at the level of second order beliefs. So we all think that this thing means certain things that we like, and that's actually relevant to us. So what's the purpose of status symbols? Social life is really complicated. It's super messy, and it's really hard to know where we stand in relation to one another. And the only way we learn this is through interaction, through having these sort of like key little heuristics that sort of tell us like, okay, you're this type of person, you're this type of person, here's how I should interact with you, right? I got to show you a little bit more respect, maybe I don't. And we do this all the time in social life, right? Like clothes tell us something about you. What club memberships do you have? Like, do you go to Equinox or do you go to like the UFit gym? I don't know if they have UFit in the Bay Area, but you know, do you go to the fancy gym or the not fancy gym? how much cultural knowledge do you have? How many times do you go to the opera? Like, are you telling me all the paintings in the museum? Like, this tells us a lot about your upbringing, about your social status, because it tells me a lot about, you know, how much time you have for luxury and irrelevant things like differentiating a Rembrandt from a Picasso or something. I don't know. And IR works in very much in the same ways, where we have to learn about who a state is through certain metrics, right? Like, what IOs do they belong in? Where do they stand in those IOs? Are they a member of the UN or the United Nations Security Council? How many Olympic medals do they have? How do they perform in war? And again, fundamentally, the purpose of a status symbol is as a signaling device, which is that they tell us that by having this symbol, they tell us that they have a particular high status attributes and that it signals something that's relevant for a particular status community. And so when we talk about status symbols in IR, there's some that always get mentioned, which is like colonies, battleships, aircraft carriers, space programs, fighter jets, and nuclear weapons. And the reason why these things are always mentioned is because they're actually really hard to acquire and they're relatively scarce. And so if you think that in IR, we care about things like military power, technological expertise, industrial capacity, whether or not you look like a great power or not, these are actually pretty useful symbols because their difficulty in acquiring makes their signaling function actually be preserved, right? Not everybody can get it. So because not everybody can get it, it is actually a useful signal to sort of like tell me like who you are, right? Like if you're able to conquer other countries and not everybody else is able to conquer other countries, like that means that you're probably pretty powerful, that you have real organizational capacities to project force and things like that. Unsurprisingly, this is our understanding of nuclear prestige, which is that nuclear weapons are difficult to build. Not everybody has them. They're associated with World War II victory, the great powers, the UN Security Council, power, expertise, great power associations. When I see this slide, even when I wrote this slide, like I find myself believing this again. I'm just like, yeah, maybe nuclear prestige is a thing. Like this seems really convincing to me. I'm going to tell you why there's all sorts of problems with this. One thing I just want to highlight here is this is a particular way of understanding nuclear prestige. Critical approaches think about it very differently. This was very useful to sort of Nick Ritchie piece in 2013, but I'm just going to set critical approaches aside. So what's the problem with having a materialist conception of nuclear prestige, right? Thinking about its destructive power, thinking about the technology that goes into it. Well, fundamentally, it's that like things don't just speak for themselves. And if you think about nuclear prestige as like this sort of symbolic outcome, well, it becomes really weird to just say the materiality of it. Like the bomb itself pretty much explains itself, right? Like you need to be able to think through the social processes by which that happens, right? And again, you have Paul Bowman and Paul Rowan that basically describe nuclear weapons as like a natural status symbol because of its power, because of the technology that goes into it, because very few states have it. And the fundamental problem with this view is that it actually brings up a lot of really hard questions to answer if you accept this. And these are the sort of questions that you bring up, right? Like if the status value of nuclear weapons is a function of their explosive power, like the materiality of the bomb itself, well, then it becomes really pointless to start thinking about like studying status and prestige, because if it's all just material capabilities, then let's just talk about material capabilities. There's no point in distinguishing the two. And it also creates this sort of issue for people like Scott Sagan, because if it is this sort of material explanation, well, it becomes unclear how nuclear prestige could have ever declined. Like nuclear weapons have only gotten more powerful over time. And so do we just sort of reject this idea that nuclear prestige declined? So does that mean that a bunch of smart people have just gotten it all wrong? It's complicated. And then very much more importantly for people interested in questions of non-proliferation is that if you accept this sort of idea that nuclear weapons are prestigious in part because they're hard to acquire, you could actually make the case that the NPT actually bolstered nuclear prestige by making nuclear weapons even that much more harder to acquire. You have somebody like Laila Galati comparing the NPT to like a sumptuary law in international politics, which is like by creating these restrictions, you make the acquisition of it even all the much more important and like valuable, because it's kind of like, wow, you really did this even though the odds were against you. I don't like these questions. They keep me up at night. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a theory that's going to help us address these questions by just sort of rejecting their premise. So here's going to be my theoretical framework, right? It's very simple, which is like I said, status symbols are signaling devices, and that to function as a good signaling device, we just have to actually agree about the thing that's being signaled. And to actually agree that we have a shared discursive framework of like, this thing means this thing, we actually need to have an understanding of how things emerge, and then ideally, how status symbols decline. This isn't great because I'm not going to talk about this part because it's not relevant for today, but I'm going to go through each of these steps right now. Status symbols as signaling devices. Okay, like I said, what's the point of status symbols? They just tell us something about you. Social life is super ambiguous. I've said the wrong thing to the wrong person too many times, right? And if I just had like a tattoo on their forehead saying, respect me, I'd be like, oh, okay, I should respect this person. Status symbols, they signal somebody's position, right? And this takes the form of many different ways and many different facets of life. As academics, we care a lot about publications. Professional sports teams, they care a lot about trophies, MVP awards, right? If I had an NBA championship ring, nobody would care among academics. So they'd be like, that's not relevant to us. Like, what are you doing that's actually relevant for your position as an academic in an academic community, right? Like, how many articles have you published in the last year? Where, right? And for me, the fundamental thing about status symbols is that they require recognition. We need to agree that we all agree that this thing actually matters, that certain symbol means high status qualities. And if you don't have this agreement, well, then you don't have a shared discursive framework. And so you don't have a status symbol to emerge because you just don't agree that the thing actually matters. I'm a political scientist. So this is kind of in my contract where I need to have like a very basic 2x2 table. The basic thing that you need to care about here is that when the group itself agrees that something signifies high status, you get status symbol emergence. And if you have all sorts of fracturing or non-recognition, you don't get it. Again, if you have any questions about this, I'm happy to talk about it as soon as I'm done. How do status symbols emerge? Well, it's through two processes, right? Unplanned and planned. Unplanned is just, I'm a high status actor. I do certain things. I have certain things. Other people around me sort of see it and they're like, that's pretty cool. Like, I want that. Like, to be as great as you are, I need to be able to do that thing. I need to be able to copy that. This creates the possibility for all sorts of like inadvertent status symbols, which is like things just happen to become seen as prestigious, even though I didn't plan on that, right? People just sort of adopt certain things. You have planned status symbols, which is like, I'm actually deliberately trying to create a sort of like positive association. You can think about like advertisements, fashion campaigns, arms fairs, military parades, propaganda. This Jan Ruger citation at the end is about naval parades in Britain and Germany, where it's kind of like you have to have this sort of like grand showing of like, look how great these battleships are. You should invest a lot of money into it, right? Like these things are not necessarily just natural things. And fundamentally, again, it requires for a symbol to become a status symbol that we all just generally agree that they signify relevant high status qualities. So one way or the other needs to result in this. Let me just sort of illustrate it for you. This is Lord of the Flies. This is an unplanned status symbol. He is holding a conch. For those of you that remember your like 7th grade reading, it's a bunch of boys stranded on an island, and they sort of have to find a way to like govern themselves. And they just happen to find this conch on the beach, and they're like, "Oh, look, a conch!" And then the kid that's holding it, he uses it, he blows on it. They all congregate, and they're like, "Okay, we should find a way to like elect a leader." And the kid who's holding a conch, there's nothing special about him. He's not the smartest. He's not the most adept. But they're like, okay, well, if you have the conch, we should vote for you. It just happens. Like, there's no magical properties about the conch. It just happens. This is from The Devil Wears Prada. This is a fashion movie. The Devil Wears Prada 2 comes out in a few months. I'm going to go see it. But again, the point being is that like they work at a fashion company, and they're like trying to push a certain narrative of like, we need to have this dress be the next big thing for our runway show. How do status symbols decline? There's 3 different ways. One of it is through spread. So like as lower status actors acquire the thing, it starts to add noise to the signal. It no longer signals high status. It signals something else entirely, right? Like if it's a commonplace thing, it's kind of like, well, I can't use this as a useful heuristic to sort of tell me who you are because everybody has it. And you also have value realignment, which is like maybe that thing signals what it signals, but we just don't care about that anymore. And so even though this may have been a high status object once, that's not what it is anymore. Regardless of the pathway, they all lead to a sort of decoupling of the symbol as signifying high status. I'm just going to show you what it looks like. This is the Devil Wears Prada again. This is a very famous monologue in the film that I so love, where she's like explaining how cerulean gowns, like cerulean, the color, fell out of like came into fashion and fell out of fashion. Where she's describing Oscar de la Renta, who's this like top fashion designer. He like premieres it at a fashion show. You know, it gets adopted by Yves Saint Laurent, and then as it gets adopted by these high status actors, it trickles down until it makes its way to like fashion chains and like clearance pins. And so all of a sudden, you have Anne Hathaway in this movie who's like wearing this lumpy blue sweater, and they're like, look at you, like you just don't appreciate these things. And the point being is that cerulean used to be a thing that high status actors should adopt until everybody did, and then you had to find a new way to create a new fashion cycle and new symbols. This is from the Russian novel Eugene Onegin. They had the ballet just a few weeks ago. It's phenomenal. I recommend you all go see it in San Francisco. Dueling used to be a thing. Dueling scars used to be a very particular status marker in Western societies. It's not anymore. And it's not because you don't get scars from dueling. You still do. But it's kind of like killing each other in the street or shooting each other, like random violence in public, is not acceptable in Western society. And so even though you can still get these same scars, we just don't value dueling as a sign of bravery, of honor anymore. And so the action might stay the same. Our understanding of it completely changes. This seems like a lot. I promise you, it's not. This is what everything I just said in a nice little diagram, which is you have a symbol, you have certain processes, planned, unplanned, that lead to something to have this sort of high status association. And then through 3 different pathways, you get symbol decline. What does any of this have to do with nuclear weapons? It's actually the exact same processes that people who argue about nuclear weapons tend to think about, which is that before the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, nuclear weapons are generally unknown. You have obviously a planned debut. The United States is planning on using this to destroy the Japanese. They know it's going to be an international event. Supposedly, you have nuclear weapons creating this high status association. They become status symbols. And then either they decline because of their spread through proliferation or through value realignment via the NPT, or they didn't. The spread thing I haven't spoken about, but if you ask me in the Q&A, I'll show you some stuff about it. And for me, what I'm interested in is this part, which is that if I can show you that nuclear weapons were never status symbols, then everything on the right becomes irrelevant. And just to remind you, this is what I'm interested in for this talk, which is showing whether or not the international community ever collectively recognized nuclear weapons as a status symbol. My argument is no, that you had US mixed messaging where part of them where they were like, yeah, they are status symbols, but you had all sorts of like US internal conflicts, so like, they're actually kind of terrible. You had Soviet opposition saying nuclear weapons are terrible, we need to ban it. And you had much of the rest of the world saying nuclear weapons are terrible, we need to ban it. We agree with this. And so for me, if you go back to our 2x2, we're actually living in the bottom right quadrant, or at least we were in the early nuclear age of nobody agreed that these things were great status symbols. And so it never emerged. I'm not going to talk too much about the historical backdrop here, but I'm going to show you right now. But this is one of my favorite quotes. It's from the UN representative to the US representative to the United Nations, writing to the Secretary of State in 1956, where he's like, communist propaganda is giving the atomic bomb a bad name. So already you got to get a sense of like, here's what the impression is, the international impression is of atomic weaponry. This is a way too brief history, but long story short, you have US planning to establish like a certain narrative of like nuclear weapons, atomic bombs, they signify America's power. This is pre-Hiroshima, so as you remember, Hiroshima happens in August 1945. And then within a few months, you actually have the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union saying, we need proposals to think about eliminating A-bombs, atomic bombs, because they're too dangerous, they're horrifying, in December 1945. So within a short period of time, you actually already have this sort of thinking about eliminating the bomb. June 1946, you have the United States and the Soviet Union offering plans of like, we need to ban the bomb. The question is, how do we get there? But the goal is a shared goal. And again, this has like a lot of global appeal where the world's like, yes, we need to ban the bomb. We just had World War II. Disarmament becomes central to Soviet discourse on nuclear weapons for quite a period of time, 1948 to 1955. The United States really hates disarmament discourse. They think that it's highly dangerous, to quote Secretary of Defense Forrestal. And the reason why is because the United States relies on its nuclear arsenal more than the Soviet Union. So they're like, we really are caught in a bind here because on the one hand, the world cares about disarmament, but on the other hand, we rely on it. So you have sort of mixed US messaging. But the United States recognizes this. And you have what's the Atoms for Peace program by President Eisenhower in December 1953, where he's like, we need to conventionalize nuclear weapons. Like we can't have it having this sort of stigma. This Atoms for Peace propaganda actually ends up having global appeal, which I'll show you in a few slides. And then you get a ban on nuclear testing for a few years. And then you get a treaty, the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963. No more open air testing. And then you get the NPT. I'm sorry, this is very brief, but I'm happy to talk more about it. This is just showing you what I just told you about. This is one of my favorite quotes again. This is Secretary of State John Foster Dulles saying, nuclear weapons are associated with the West, with the hated doctrine of white supremacy. 1957. This is the Soviet Union saying, hey, disarmament. The Americans are like, oh, no. All right, so methods. How do we know a status symbol? Long story short is that we just talk to each other. We just know about the world around us because we just talk. And so we know something that signifies competence, that it's tasteful and it's excellent because other people have told us, we sort of spoken about it amongst ourselves. Now, I'm going to take this language component very seriously in terms of how I think about gauging whether or not nuclear procedure exists. What I think about is this, right? Which is, let's begin from the premise that status symbols depend on certain communities and that they really do matter in terms of like how we talk about it, right? So for me, the easy analogy is like the NBA, right? Which is like the NBA really likes championship rings. Like if you are LeBron James, you want 6, you want to be Jordan. And what you don't see in the NBA is people saying championships are terrible, awards mean nothing. Like if these things meant nothing and the rest of the NBA all agreed that like trophies didn't mean anything, you wouldn't have the NBA. Like you would have like, I don't know, rec league basketball. Part of it is because you need to be able to have certain markers like, we know you're a great team, right? Otherwise you're just playing for fun. And academics very much operate in the same way, which is that they care about academic publications and they care about particular kinds of academic publications, right? For them, they care about publishing in national security, international organizations, security studies. And when we talk about these things, we generally talk about it in very positive rhetoric. This is going to be the key point here, right? Like we know that these things matter because people will tell you that these things matter. Like this is a huge part of graduate school training. And it doesn't necessarily matter what you think or what like smaller status communities think, because ultimately I can say, I think IS is a terrible journal, but it doesn't necessarily matter what I think. It matters what Jim Fearon thinks because he's the big guy in the room. But the fundamental point is that like, these are group specific things, right? And fundamentally, when we think about what a status symbol is, we should be able to capture how group members talk about it or how they view the thing in question. So we need measures that are going to be able to capture, discourse or opinions. How do I do this? I do this in 3 different ways. I'm only going to show you this one today, but if you ask me, I'll show you this one as well, which is discourse sentiment analysis, which is like, can we systematically capture how the world, how the international community of states has spoken about nuclear weapons across time? There's an asterisk there because I only have it until 1962 today, but that's okay. And so for me, I'm like, okay, is there data on this? And the answer is yes, there is. We have the United Nations General Assembly speeches, which are considered a barometer of world opinion. These are headliner events. They happen every year. They're done by most participating countries. They're done by heads of state delegates. States are free to talk about what they want to talk about. Sometimes there are little themes that go around, but generally states can say whatever they want. There's some time limits that have emerged over time. But generally speaking, these are pretty useful ways to think about how a state's publicly representing itself in front of the international community. And people have used this before to think through state preferences, good governance discourse, and how states generally just talk about status. Right? So I'm going to use this data. And And what I use in this data for is I just hand code a bunch of nuclear mentions in these speeches. Like I just read every country that has ever spoken about nuclear stuff. And I just code at the level of the paragraphs, like not a census. So it's like if you have a paragraph like, oh, nuclear weapons are this, nuclear weapons are that, nuclear weapons are this, nuclear weapons are that. I just code it as like a one mention. What I do is I just sort of look at them like, did they use the word atom, atomic, nuclear, hydrogen, neutron? This is a useful first cut, so you can just get a sense of like, are they talking about nuclear weapons or not? And then I sort of classify it of, are they talking about weapons, energy, or something else? I'm only going to show you the weapons and energy today. And then in the context of the paragraph or speech around it, is it positive, negative, or generally neutral? So just to recap where I stand, where other people stand, I'm going to show you the data right now, but basically here's the three observable expectations. If they're right and if I'm right, we should see always positive discourse until 1963, or never any positive discourse. All right, so what does the data look like? It looks wonderful for me. I have about 2,556 observations so far in the first 16 years, and then about more than half of these refers to energy and weapons. For those, again, this is not including the neutral statements, but fundamentally, the ones that talk about like very clearly negative or positive, it's overwhelmingly positive when we talk about nuclear energy, and it's overwhelmingly negative when we talk about nuclear weapons. What does that look like across the world? This is a snapshot of those first 16 years. Green means positive, red means negative. This is how the world has talked about nuclear energy. Super green. People love nuclear energy. They're like, yes, we need nuclear energy for peaceful uses. Like, this is going to be the thing that's going to solve the energy crisis that's afflicting the underdeveloped world, as they say. Peru and Colombia, there's sort of low outliers here. This is nuclear weapon discourse at the level of the world. Again, green means positive, red means negative. It's red. It's less red, deep red. There is no green on this map at all. Like the world, when they talk about nuclear weapons, they talk about it in extremely negative ways. So for me, the question becomes is like, okay, if nuclear weapons are status symbols, how do we know? That's not how the way states talk about it. This is the same thing over time. 1 is very positive. 0 is like, it's pretty mixed, neutral. -1 is completely negative. This is what the world thinks about. They generally talk about nuclear weapons across the data in very negative ways. Contrast this with how they talk about nuclear energy. It's pretty negative, and then it just spikes up. And why does it spike up? This is the Atoms for Peace program. So Eisenhower's propaganda actually worked. You have this real distinction of like, atomic energy can be used for good, and we actually need more of it. And so it actually stays above the line after 1953. Now, one of the things I always get a question about is like, how do the nuclear weapon states talk about it? Let me show you. This is the United States. They test before, so we don't have data on this. Negative, 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 spike up after Atoms for Peace, drops back down, negative, negative, negative. The Russians, negative the whole time. They test, they still stay negative. I don't have observations for every year sometimes because sometimes they just don't talk about it in very clear, positive or negative ways. The British, negative, get about to be neutral, negative. The French, negative, and then they're starting to plan to test. They go up and then they get so embarrassed and they hate the United Nations for really giving it to them for colonial conflict in Algeria that they just leave the United Nations for a few years. And so you actually don't have any data until like 1964, 1965. Okay, and conclusion. What did I talk about today? I told you that I was going to be interested in explaining whether or not the international community ever recognized nuclear weapons as status symbols. And I said no. I need to finish it, but no, right now. And then future research is, well, if I'm right, then how is this myth so prevalent? How has this myth affected US nonproliferation policy? And under what conditions are nuclear weapons acts ever prestigious? Thank you.
Thank you so much. You want to stay up there? Do you want to come back and sit down here? You want to
Stay up here, Jim. Actually,
Okay.
no, we'll have equality.
And we've got some questions in the chat, which I'll get to momentarily, but we will start with the fellows. So we've got you two right here. So yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Kevin, thanks for the talk. That's really...
And will you introduce yourself for everyone else?
Yeah. I'm Austin Gruber, visiting fellow here at CSAC. I had two questions for you as far as the definition of status symbols and the role of necessity as it plays to status symbols. So Pakistan comes to mind when I think of a status symbol and the belief that they pursued the weapon primarily as a counterbalance to a larger, more conventional force. And so they acted out of necessity, maybe not necessarily out of status. And are things like no first use more of a signaling because of status, because it shows restraint, because there is no necessity. So I kind of look at that similar to like your Rolex example. Like I have other things that can function in that capacity, but I'm intentionally meeting that criteria of a high status item that I don't have to pursue. So kind of the role of necessity when you think about status. And then as you talked about the negative discourse around the weapon, when the nuclear states talk about negative discourse, is that a means to preclude further proliferation and maintain their current status? Thanks.
These are great questions, Austin. So the first question, let me take the second one first. So when nuclear states talk about nuclear weapons, do they talk about negatives that way nobody else wants it? Maybe, but I have a more simpler explanation, which is these are hugely destructive items. And so I don't necessarily care for them as status symbols because I'm already gray from the US or the Soviet Union. And so I just don't want anybody else to be able to challenge me militarily. Like that's my simple answer here. And then for the first question, I mean, right now there's a really annoying problem in status scholarship where for them they have basically like this oppositional understanding of status and necessity. So it's like if you do it for necessity, then you do it for security reasons. And if you do it for non-necessary reasons, then it must be status driven because you're like spending money that you don't need to spend because you want to look badass or something, right? I think that's not a useful dichotomy. And so for me, I'm more than happy to talk to you more about this, like in terms of thinking through status and necessity as, complementary rather than oppositional. But I think that's a useful way of thinking about it.
Go ahead, X.
Hi, thank you for the talk. Very interesting theory. So my question is more kind of it's both theoretical and kind of empirical on how you measure whether something is a status symbol. To think at conceptual level, my question is, can something be both perceived negatively and simultaneously serve as a status symbol, right? So if we think about conspicuous consumption, think about private jet, whenever people talk about it, we talk about negatively, right? It's a harm to the environment, it's unnecessary, it's inefficient from an economic perspective. But when someone have a private jet, it's a status symbol, it goes without saying, right? So in a way, that nuclear weapon could do the same thing. And even more kind of challenging possibility is it's precisely because nuclear weapon is have this kind of negative connotation or any kind of mass destruction. It actually makes it more of a status symbol because it actually come as some kind of costly signal, right? Because my status is so high, I'm willing to take this hit on my reputation to possess this very destructive object.
So the first question, I think it's interesting. For me, that's a question of status communities. So like you're right, I agree. Like I would see a private jet as a status symbol while also still understanding these negative components to it. But I think that I don't know if you're a billionaire, like you don't care. Like you're like a private jet is just what you have. And so for me, I think there's two ways of thinking about that, right? Which is one, what's the relevant status audience? And then two, how do we actually balance these things out, right? Like on the one hand, private jet signals massive amounts of wealth. On the other hand, it does signal, maybe you don't care about the environment. But on the other hand, if you're Taylor Swift, like, do you want her taking commercial flights? Like, isn't that a safety harm? And so, like, how you actually weigh these things in the total sum of it, I don't know. But this is it's an interesting line of argument. I hadn't thought about private jets, but that's good. WMD question, I don't see it that way just historically, only because for me, the U.S. doesn't do it for status reasons. They just do it for their own reasons, like to win the war. The Russians don't, in my view, I wish David Holliday was here. They do it for security reasons to counterbalance the United States. But the Great Britain and the French, in my reading of it, like they are very much in the middle of decolonization. Like they need a new claim to fame. So I don't see their decisions as necessarily being like, we're high status and we're going to do this, so we're happy to take the status hit. It's like we need to be relevant, and if we don't have nuclear weapons, we're going to be irrelevant. So for me, I just don't see it. I mean, it's an interesting question, but I just don't see the dynamic empirically. Thanks, Jay.
I actually think the private jets fit the category of high status and then decline, because I think people now look at it as so uncool to have a private jet look at your carbon footprint. So I actually think I don't think it's state of, but I don't have one, so I don't. So we'll open it up. We'll go over here, and then we'll go to Ori, and then I'm going to go to a couple of the questions that came in.
Thank you. So I have two questions as well. So first, I want to follow up on X's comment because that was something that I kind of thought throughout this is, does prestige and high status necessarily equate to positive or like a lack of positive comments, specifically thinking about things like how the terrible destruction of the bomb, like while that, yes, looks bad, it also confers prestige to the state that has it because it shows that you have the ability to wreak such devastation that no one else has. So it's still prestige in that way, even if it's not positive prestige. So I was just wondering, like, yeah, if you could just elaborate more on that. And I kind of like offering another way to think about it is that opposite of prestige might not be negativity, but simply not caring about something or not talking about it. So I don't know if you could go back to your slide on the life cycle of nuclear prestige. So yeah, so if we think about the opposite of prestige, not just being negativity, but being like just a general lack of relevance, then I think you might be able to get to other observable implications that you can test, specifically based on like how the status symbol declines. So if the status symbol declines through spread via proliferation, we should see relevance decreasing. And where nuclear weapons just note like they're just no longer seen as relevant, as important in any way. It's just like, oh, another state has it, okay, let's move on to the next day. However, if we have value realignment via the NPT, then we should actually see a decline of nuclear prestige through things such as this negativity in the way that, you know, for example, you brought up the dueling example. We see this decline of prestige because it actually is viewed as antithetical to our norms. So those just might be two different observable implications based on like how you might define prestige or lack thereof. And then one more question that follows from this is, do you think that based on your definition of prestige, that there are states that would forego nuclear weapons if they had the option to because of its lack of status?
Say the last part again.
Do you think that there are states that would forego getting the nuclear option, getting nuclear weapons if they had the ability to, like nothing hindering them? Would they forego getting nuclear weapons because they saw nuclear weapons as low status? Or do you think that despite the negativity around surrounding nuclear weapons, almost every state that has the ability, if they had the ability to get them, they would get them?
Let me start off. Thank you, AB. I think it's an interesting second question, right? It's like on the one hand, requires a particular view of the world that's like you're living in a vacuum. So like for me, I don't know, if you're Japan, South Korea, Germany, you can probably go nuclear, but there's the fact that they can go nuclear, like they're gonna have pushback one way or the other. And so like I don't know how to imagine a world in which they don't get pushback and using like that's sort of the weird fundamental problem here. But yes, like I think you would see plenty of states that even if they could, they just wouldn't unless you have, I don't know, massive proliferation, in which case you're doing it for security reasons, not prestige reasons. So that's the easy answer to the second one. The first one is, let me start off with the spread point. So the problem with the spread pathway here is that like Ken Waltz and like Bob Jervis make it. And like I've seen the CIA make it, but nobody has actually ever developed it. And so what you're saying is actually really interesting, right? Which is like you can have the thing turn irrelevant through spread, but not necessarily, you know, have a negative association. I think that's perfectly plausible, and I would like to see somebody actually make the spread argument properly. I mean, I would agree with this. For me, the fundamental issue with this idea of prestige and high status as, you know, being necessarily tied to, you know, an outsized ability for destruction is that I think it requires, I'm not saying this is you, but I think it requires you to be a sadist. Like, it requires you to say like these things are so militarily destructive that this is a good thing. Like one of the things I don't code for is like how bad people talk about nuclear war. And so like unless you think that nuclear war is a good outcome, like it becomes really hard for me to understand how you can actually equate nuclear weapons as prestigious because of the destructive capacity, unless you have a qualifier. You do see this in the data where they'll say things like, because they're so destructive, they stop the communist advance. Okay, so like that's a defensive thing. Like it stopped these aggressive Russians. But again, that's under what I had at the end, right? Which is like that's a particular condition. So it's not just destructive capacity, because killing people is not necessarily a good thing. It's just for what are you using it for? That's my 2 cents on that.
I have Ori, Satara, Elizabeth, and then I'm gonna and Tom. But before I get to Tom, after I do those three, I'm gonna go to 2 online.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kevin, for a great presentation. I also read the paper you circulated a few months ago. I think this is a great project, and I can't wait to read it. So we already emailed about this, but I'm going to probe you on these 2 questions that I have. First of all, about the issue of the beliefs having to be collective and universal. Do they? Do we really need the entire international community to sign on to one unified value for us to talk about the emergence of a status symbol? And you refer to this. This is just me kind of picking a nuance, because you say that some states signed on to it and some haven't. And my question is, I mean, we all understand that there are status symbols, at least for some states, and perhaps they're not as status symbols for others. Do we really need that to be universal? Maybe the countries that are thinking about nuclear weapons only need to send the costly signals we mentioned to one part of the group. So I'm following up on the Rolls-Royce example. Okay, so some people see it as, a glitzy, fancy, great status symbol. Others see it as a form of corruption, flamboyance, or maybe carelessness about the environment. But maybe our group only needs to signal to the first group, and you mentioned it, right? Group selection. Maybe we don't need the entire community. Maybe it's enough to have 80%, 75%. Like where do we draw the line of that being universal? And my second question, and again, we emailed on this, is the usefulness of speeches at the UN, because I think it's possible to conceive of these speeches as reflecting diplomatic messaging and not necessarily the views of the decision makers at that given point in time, because it's just one venue. I think it is useful. My question is, how do we qualify it? Because we know that some countries sent their diplomats to talk about nuclear weapons negatively. And by the way, and I wasn't aware of the example you showed about the nuclear weapon states themselves talking about it negatively. And on the other hand, the leadership was pursuing nuclear weapons. And we emailed about India. I'm thinking about Egypt, right? Egypt was a vocal castigator of nuclear weapons, and Nasser went to the Egyptians Nasser went to the Soviets and the Chinese wanting it. So how can we perhaps make this a bit more precise? And lastly, and I swear I'll stop here, I think one useful concept would be Amos Zahavi's handicap principle. He proposed costly signaling as buying credibility because of the handicap and the cost that they incur. So that could maybe be something useful.
And I also just, because one of the questions online was related, Paul Myers asking about the attention, getting the attention of high status actors that aren't, that's not available before a state becomes nuclear. That's not me. And okay.
Somebody, please.
It's somebody else. So asking about India, saying that Bill Clinton made a trip to Delhi, was the first by a US president in over 20 years, and came about after India conducted its 98 tests. So it got the attention of a high status actor by doing the test. So which is related, I think, to Ori's question.
So, Ori, if I may, let me just answer this online one first. So the attention thing is interesting. For me, attention can be positive, it can be negative. I think, I don't know enough about the India 1998 case enough to speak precisely on the specifics. I have to look into it more, but for me, attention can go either way. And so like, I don't think attention is enough. And depending on how you think about the India case, like if you think that they went nuclear in 74, which when they tested, well, then all of a sudden the 1998 test is an entirely different context. And so like, there's probably a lot more going on here than just testing in terms of for like high status attention, right? I hope that answers your question, Paul. But Ori, I have taken your comments and I've put it all in the appendix because I have thought about it so much. So the first point is, why focus on the international community? And in reality, there's no reason. I just want to. You can focus on any other smaller state groupings, but in reality, previous work focuses on the international community at large. So like part of that is being consistent. But if I can see, good argument to be made with good evidence of, France getting higher status in NATO after they went nuclear, I think that's perfectly consistent with my argument. Like again, I'm thinking about the international level, but I'm more than happy to leave open that these findings may not travel at lower status communities. And then for me, the next step would be like, under what conditions, how do like states think about the relevant status communities when they go nuclear? So that's the first part. But for the second part, which goes to your question on how good is this metric? I'd use, like, I have a bunch of other data. I'm taking a page out of your book, which is go and do archival stuff. And so one of the things I've been wanting to do is like just seeing how the United States has thought about the reactions, like when they've captured the foreign reactions of states going nuclear, how do they actually respond to it? And this is from the Soviet Union. This is like 1949, 1950, I want to say. But they're like, when the Soviets went nuclear, things were pretty calm. There's actually no prestige talk early on here. It's just like, it's a thing that happened. But then when you actually see the Chinese go nuclear, it's very different. You see like, there is no panic, which is a great thing. We have spent years of propaganda preparing for this. And you have all sorts of really interesting, it's a bit more mixed because you do see like perhaps a little bit more pride. But I've actually seen, especially with the China case, like I know there's evidence that Algeria in the UN actually talks about China pretty positively. And you actually see this with this sort of evidence as well. And so for me, I guess one of the questions would be like, if I had a full universe of like public opinion reactions to tests, how well does that track with what they're saying at the UN? I don't know yet. I mean, I think it's interesting. I'm trying to get around it. I promise you, I'm trying to get around it. Just takes time.
Go ahead, Stu.
Thank you, Kevin, for a wonderful presentation. We have had a number of discussions on the topic before, which were as insightful as the presentation today. Part of my question has already been addressed, but let me try to put it slightly differently. And what I want to ask is like, where do you need to differentiate prestige from necessity? Because in certain cases, prestige is the byproduct of necessity. I mean, going back to the example of Pakistan, for example, Pakistan's prime minister said we would eat grass, but may build the bomb, which they did. But that was out of sheer necessity. But over the period, I think that necessity has in a way gained some element of prestige as well. Now the weapons are being seen as many you prefer to call it crown jewels of the nation, because they developed out of necessity. It brought security what the country needed, and the byproduct of that is security, self-assurance is prestige. That brings some element of prestige. It draws attention to all issues which were perhaps neglected by the great powers. So how do you differentiate between prestige and necessity, or security for that matter? Because at a certain point, they basically become the same, or one actually feeds into the other.
Thank you, Zara. So I do think this is actually where things get a bit tricky. And I've gone through like a lot of CIA documents of like the French nuclear program, and they have a similar line of reasoning here where they'll say like national independence, like national self-determination, like the ability to see yourself as a sovereign country who's in charge of your own security is a prestige act. And so at that point, then you're equating prestige and security. And I haven't figured that part out yet. So like that is sort of tricky because normally we like to distinguish these things. But for me, if that's the case, then I struggle to see what's the value of a prestige argument over just saying security or self-determination. Like, again, I'm sure these things, there is a relationship here. I'm just not sure how useful it is at that point to actually treat them as completely separate. I know that's not answering your question. It's just, it's an intractable issue for me right now.
Elizabeth.
Thanks so much, Kevin. This was a great talk. My name's Elizabeth Good. I'm a postdoc at CSAC. So my question is about your data. and your coding of sentiment analysis. So I think hand coding all of this is a huge undertaking and one that really allows you to get at nuance. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to that. And specifically, I'm wondering how you go about coding instances in which the sentiment about the bomb is negative, but it's because the adversaries have it. So it's saying like, this is, a huge catastrophe, all of these things, humanitarian destruction, really, really negative sentiment, but it's because these other actors can't be trusted rather than the weapon itself. And whether or not there's a distinction with that in your data and how you're going about addressing that. Thanks so much.
Sorry. Yes, thank you. There was a data question here that I'm going to add to it, because the question from Kartika Sasikumar is, to what extent are the data, your data dependent on your source? If you were to look at, say, a sample of the Journal of Foreign Affairs instead of U.S. or speeches at the UN General Assembly, you might see more appreciation of the nuclear weapon as a status symbol.
So I haven't done, let me answer the online one first, and then to Elizabeth. I haven't looked at the foreign affairs. I mean, I've looked at foreign affairs a little bit in terms of the historical stuff. I haven't coded it. I mean, I guess I wonder if that would be very much biased, because it's kind of like a lot of academics, policymakers, random people, they're influential, but not necessarily. So like, I guess I don't know what that would look like. And I guess I also would wonder if that data would be biased by people pushing particular agendas. Like if I'm a nuclear scientist and I want more testing, well, then I might talk about nuclear weapons as more prestigious in foreign affairs. And so like, how do you balance that out? I don't know what that tells us, I guess, is what I'm saying. To Elizabeth's point, so for me, I think the fundamental problem that I have had with constructivist approaches to nuclear topics, right? And this is very much thinking about Nina Tannenwald, is like, there is this distinction being made between the acquisition of nuclear weapons, the possession of nuclear weapons, and the use of nuclear weapons. Now, for me, those three things are fundamentally intertwined, right? Like, if you want to use them, if you want to possess them, you need to acquire them first, right? So like, how do you actually distinguish that? I don't know. And so like, this gets directly into your question, right? Like, maybe I don't have personal issues with the bomb itself. I have a personal issue with my adversaries having it. Oh, sorry. I was like, wait, what are you? So like, I don't know how to. The only way I've sort of tried balancing that out, right, is that people can also just equally say, and I do see this in the data a little bit, right, which is like, our nuclear arsenals are good, theirs is bad. And so for me, the fact that we only see much like just one side of that tells me a lot, which is like, you don't feel comfortable enough to say that nuclear weapons are good in some cases and negative in others. We just sort of see like a widespread negative discourse. And so like, I guess part of it is because I guess what the normative international structure looks like, you don't see necessarily just pure condemnations of their bomb, it's the bomb itself. And so to the extent that we and my side has these nuclear weapons, it's almost as if like it's a reluctant have, right? Like we needed to defend ourselves against them. So I know that's not necessarily getting at what you're saying here, but I think that with the data that I have, I think it'll allow this sort of like more fine-tuned investigation of these sort of questions, which is an interesting question. Thank you.
Yeah, Emily had a two-finger, and I'll come over to you in a bit. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of add on to the question online. I get why foreign affairs may not be the place that's not like a country level presentation, it's an individual person. However, I do think one thing that is important to do is to think about what kind of performative language is being used at these United Nations meetings. And there might
It's not working. Oh, yeah, that makes a lot more sense. I was like, it's very quiet in here. It might make sense for you to take seriously the idea that maybe powers like the P5 are natively talking about nuclear weapons, even though they think they're prestige symbols, because they think they don't want other countries to get them. So they're like performing negative, like nuclear weapons as a negative status symbol, which I think also gets at maybe some of the other questions. But I think what would be very fascinating to look at are the discussions like in strategic debates and particularly like journals within countries. Like there is often like military or government sponsored journals that are put out that discuss nuclear weapons. And I think a big alternative explanation you could rule out, you could use those to rule out the alternative explanation that this is all performance, and to really think about like looking at how a particular country views decisions about going nuclear is, I think that's really what you're trying to get at. And using UNGA data doesn't really get at that. So I think, yeah, that's my 2 cents. I guess you could take it or leave it.
No, Emily, this is a wonderful question. I think for me, the distinction that I'm making is that I don't want to overclaim and say I can explain that no country has ever thought about their nuclear arsenals as prestigious, or that they've never gone nuclear for prestige reasons. So, like with this question of strategic journals, that would be getting more at this sort of question, right? Of do countries go nuclear for prestige reasons? For me, I actually really care about that performance, right? Which is like, why do you feel the need to find that performance appropriate? Like, why do you need, even if you think it's a social fiction, why are we acting it out? And so for me, when I think about, how we act in front of others, we do it because we want to make sure that we have the cohesion of the group. And so if they're going to say that communist propaganda has given the atomic bomb a bad name, well, you can have two options, right? You can either continue to double down and talk about the atomic bomb in a negative way, or you can say, no, actually, it's great. And so for me, the fact that the United States decides to double down and not necessarily embrace Soviet discourse, but to not necessarily challenge that, I think that actually tells us a lot about the way they're reading the international situation. For me, I'm interested in how the international community understands it itself. And so the fact that the P5 talk about it in negative ways, it's only useful for me in terms of that's how the rest of the non-nuclear world thinks about it. Like, oh, look, they think it's negative. Shouldn't we?
I'm going to go to Scott Sagan, and then I have Tom, Shreya, and we have this gentleman over here. And so I will, let me do Scott's first. Okay. Kevin, prestige of an item goes down. One, if everyone has the item. So if everyone has the item is one argument for why prestige goes down. But it could also be, number two, prestige of an item goes down if everyone could get it, whether or not they do. Or three, the status goes down if someone without status on other dimensions now gets the item. The NPT could cause the status of nuclear weapons to go down. On causal mechanism number two, again, if everyone could get it, whether or not they do it, because Article 4 helps helps states get nuclear power plants and hence plutonium. And number three would suggest that status went down when India and/or Pakistan tested nuclear weapons. If you recall, number three was status goes down if someone without status on other dimensions now gets the item. So like India and Pakistan test, so now the status goes down. Is this right? And can you test for this?
I mean, so like in theory, I could. I don't know how I would test those first two, but the last one I definitely could. I mean, this is sort of again my crystal ball example, which is like this sort of staggered decline. I guess the way I've sort of thought about the data is, if we're going to see the sort of effect by spread, then you should see, high, then low, low, low over time. But because we already start off at low, I don't actually know how much more of an effect spread can actually make. But I hadn't thought about the second point regarding Article 4 of the NPT, which I think is interesting. But I do think that fundamentally, the real prestige thing is nuclear energy, not nuclear weaponry. And so like, I know there's it's a small leap from one to the other, but I do think that even if we're going to accept the sort of premise of the NPT and Article 4, like I think that it might be ameliorating status concerns because it at least superficially gives access to the possibility of building nuclear energy. But that's just my 2 cents.
Okay, I'm going to take the three questions that are in the room here, and then you'll have the last word to however you want to respond. So Tom, please go ahead.
Thanks. This is a great project. Very interesting. 3 quick points. So the first is on the relationship between myth and prestige, because there's a sense in which prestige is mythical by nature. So we're creating it. It's a figment of our collective imagination. So the very fact that there's a myth means there is at least one community of discourse in which the prestige is existing. So it sounds as though what you're trying to do is disaggregate the community or the discursive community in which the myth does exist or where there is prestige from the community of discourse in which that prestige doesn't exist. And this distinction between the discussions that you've been having about foreign affairs discourse versus UNGA discourse seems to be tracking that to a certain extent. But if you think about that as a Venn diagram, there's some pool of actors who are in both discursive communities. And so I think it would be interesting to try and figure out exactly where does the prestige discourse hold some sway and exactly where doesn't it? And where is that line of division? And to what extent are actors with some kind of decision-making authority in the discourse in which this myth does exist, where there is prestige? The second
could also potentially see their statements in private documents that you could also get access to and see whether they match.
Exactly. So they're in different discursive communities. They may be saying different things in those different communities. And the very fact that the myth exists is indicative that there is at least some discursive community in which the prestige holds. The second point is that when you're discussing the narrative of decline, you describe your myth theory as rejecting both the decline theory and the endurance theory. But it's also possible that yours is consistent with the decline theory because within the community where prestige had held, as opposed to the community in which you identified prestige not holding at the time in question, it declined subsequent to the NPT. But even on that, I would suggest the NPT is just one possible factor there. So it coincides with the rise of human rights law, with the rise of human rights discourse, with the anti-war rhetoric coming out of the Vietnam War and discourse coming out of the Vietnam War, various other factors that are potentially relevant to thinking about how that decline occurs. And I wouldn't limit it just to the role of the NPT because there are many other factors that are potentially relevant. And then the third point, just very quickly, is when you're thinking about the prestige of a weapon in particular, which is a thing about which we would normally talk negatively, it might be useful to control for that by trying to figure out how the positive negative discourse with nuclear weapons relates to other kinds of weapons, especially weapons of mass destruction. And there you might see some difference in the way nuclear weapons are discussed as compared to biological weapons, chemical weapons, or other kinds of weapons that cause severe harm. And if that's the case, then we might see at least some delta in prestige across these different kinds of weapons that would be different from comparing nuclear weapons to nuclear energy, because we generally speak relatively positively about energy, obviously, until we start getting into climate change and some of those phenomena.
He's giving you a research agenda that's going to carry you forward for many, many, many years. All right, Shreya and this gentleman, super quick.
Okay, Shreya Lad, a research assistant to Scott Sagan. I have 7 questions, so I will try to condense them into 2 quick points. Okay, 1 quick point, fine. Yeah, so I'm curious as to what your explanation is as to why this myth has persisted, because where I'm standing, this is a story of social construction. I can buy both arguments that there's a materialist root to the nuclear weapons as status symbols, and whether that status is positive or negative is socially constructed and changes over time. And I think this is like consistent with what Tom said about how your story is not necessarily inconsistent with the NPT story if one buys the nuclear apartheid explanation, right? If the goal of the NPT is to freeze in place this post-World War II regime and make sure that the non-aligned world or the third world that is trying to actively reimagine the status quo in very drastic ways, never gets nuclear weapons, then it is consistent with this goal that the legitimacy or status of nuclear weapons declines over time. The NPT works. but then if your theory is different as to why this myth has persisted, then I'm curious to know what your explanation is, if that makes sense.
And last, super quick, will you get and the mic over?
Thank you for all your work. I was wondering, have you used large language models to interrogate your database? And if you do, then you can expand it readily to all that's in the literature, in the broader literature, to compare a country's status and the populace of the country's status.
Just very briefly, just the last point. I have tried large language models, but I've spent months trying to figure it out and I just never could. And so it was just so much easier to do it by hand, but that's a fault of me, not on the models themselves.
I think you'll find a lot of help from the large language models, and it will let you broaden your perspective between just the General Assembly and then the people in the countries. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you for all these questions. These are wonderful points regarding the sort of like mythical prestigious component. I have thought about it and it is weird and I just don't know what to make of it. And you see it in the data where people are like, there's a so-called nuclear club out there. But I need to think more about that because like, what do I do with that, right? Like, how do I actually square that circle between, we don't think this is true, but we think that other people think it's true. And so like, it is sort of a strange oppositional discourse. In terms of prestige of weapons of mass destruction, I never thought about comparing it like that. The one thing that I have thought about and I've tried doing is nuclear weapons and space programs. I just sort of looked at it and like, but space programs are not weapons, right? Like they can be used for weapons, but they're not. So I have to compare it. Like I have to think about more like how does nuclear weapons stack up to like chemical weapons or something. And then for Shreya's point, I have different explanations. Part of it I think is just Eurocentrism in a lot of nuclear scholarship. I think it's a lot of short-term memory. I think we just sort of see the NPT and we say, oh, the 5 nuclear powers just happen to be on the United Nations Security Council, and we forget that like these countries were Security Council members before they were nuclear powers. I think that there's this part here where we think energy and weaponry is like the same thing. I had like plenty of evidence for this, but this is my favorite part, which is, and this is actually very serious. I was at a national lab in the last summer, and like I was just doing this stuff for like a week, and I almost felt myself becoming a believer. I was like, wow, these things are so powerful. Like it's hard not to like sort of accept that they really are great. And so like for me, I understand that like if you look at this too closely, it is easy to sort of like come to sort of accept this sort of myth of nuclear prestige. It's very easily to get caught in the trap of it, I think.
Great. This was great. Great talk. Great questions. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much.